Hello everyone, I am your host, the Sea Monster, and welcome to part 3 of my essay video series on The Mummy 2017. We have been on quite a journey here, but we are at the final part of this series now. We covered the film's story, characters, world building, thematic core, etc. back in the previous 2 parts, so I recommend checking back at those 2 if you have not seen them yet. But for everyone else who's been following this series up to this point, we are now about to get into how the film does when it comes to its technical fidelity. Now with all that said, let's dive right in. When it comes to the film's visual effects and action sequences, while they may not be the best in the market, the film does still feature visual work that is done mostly well. There are several moments which are visually striking, such as when Amunet conjures up a sandstorm and it engulfs the city and envelops right behind her, as if to signify that her wrath and desire for her chosen exceeds beyond her physical vessel. It's a grand sequence in the third act that is also a neat callback to the Mummy films that starred Brendan Fraser. Although it is kind of strange to see Nick and Jenny being able to outrun a sandstorm of all things on foot. Okay, maybe Nick having a military background would give him some sort of edge over that goof, but Jenny is an archaeologist, and it's very apparent that she's not an archaeologist in the same vein as the likes of Indiana Jones or Nathan Drake, whom we see embark on larger-than-life and perilous adventures. In fact, it's even weirder once you notice your average civilians outrunning the sandstorm at first. At least the film has it so the storm eventually engulfs our heroes at some point, but it's still later than what one would say is theoretically possible, especially when this is a storm of supernatural origin. It's also pretty odd that the gusts of wind from this sandstorm is strong enough to blow over cars and even a double-decker bus, but not 2 people. Strange. The sandstorm sequence is still a rousing start for a series of harrowing sequences where Nick and Jenny are left to their own devices to evade Amunet and her undead forces, all of those ultimately culminating to Nick's final confrontation with the Mummy Princess herself. It just has a couple things worth noting that are a bit off. Backtracking to an earlier point in the film, we have the plane sequence, where Nick and Jenny have to survive and get out of a plane while it's in free fall due to Amunet sending a murder of cursed crows to bring it down. The sequence features them floating around in a zero-gravity type of way in order to find parachutes, and then tumbling around while trying to make sure they don't get sucked out of a big gap that is in the hull of the plane. When only one parachute has been found up to that point, Nick lends it to Jenny and saves her while he stays behind and goes down with the plane. It's an intense sequence that gives off a strong sense that the people in the plane are actually in danger, especially considering that the filmmakers actually took a military plane up into the sky in order to realistically portray this harrowing scenario. Many folks, even a decent chunk of the film's detractors, have gone on to consider this sequence to be a highlight in the film, and I couldn't agree more. It's just a shame that some of the trailers for this film did such an injustice to this particular scene, especially the initial release of the IMAX teaser, which was literally missing layers of audio. The word awkward doesn't even cover it. Nonetheless, the plane sequence is a pretty well done and intense set piece overall. We also have the first encounter with Amunet, where Nick and Jenny have to escape from the undead princess via an ambulance, only to be pursued and attacked by her zombie minions. While the green screen is definitely a bit spotty here and there, the sequence is still pretty intense as Nick tries to keep the vehicle in control while him and Jenny try to fight off some zombies. It all culminates in the vehicle crashing down a hill, as well as an appearance by Amunet, whom Nick is forced to confront. Then he tries to fight her, which results in an awkward moment of attempted humor where Amunet uppercuts him into some trees and out of frame, followed up by him falling right back down. Yep, there's that awkward shifting in tone again. Good thing Amunet put that curse on him so that he wouldn't die from that fall, I guess. So we had this intense sequence that's about to culminate in the ominous threat of the film's title monster approaching, and then we get a bit of slapstick out of nowhere. We didn't need this bit of humor here because we already had a bit of humor earlier where Nick unknowingly makes a U-turn back to the church and the Amunet. realizing that she's in his head despite his initial denial of it. That bit right there was all we really needed in terms of just a dash of humor during a sequence of suspense and intensity before the zombies come back. Despite the awkward bit of humor at the end, the sequence was still fairly well done. Now, while I consider the visual work in The Mummy 2017 to be mostly good, that does mean there's some that isn't all that great, or at least is just kinda mediocre. If I had to criticize any aspect of the film's CGI, it would have to be for some on the zombies. While I understand that these are supposed to be soulless undead drones that look like they literally had the life sucked out of them, I can't help but think that some of this would have been better served if there was just a little more of a mix between practical effects and CGI. With Aminette, when she starts out as a creeping, crawling mummy, that's fine for her to start out as all CGI because she's literally thousands of years old and it certainly would take more than 2 people for her to regain her power. But when it comes to her zombie minions, a proper mix of CGI and makeup could have helped make some of these creatures look more realistic, or at least as close to realistic as a walking corpse can be. And that doesn't even exclude when we see a whole horde of zombies running after Nick and Jenny in the Crossrail, where parts of that horde honestly looks unfinished in spots. Like, they put a lot of the CGI budget towards most of the action scenes throughout the film, only to skimp out on this part here. It's kind of a shame too, because there's some parts involving these CG zombies that still looks pretty striking and even kinda scary. Like when Nick Morton has to swim away from a bunch of zombies underwater while trying to rescue Jenny. While it's not the worst CGI out there, certainly far from it, it could have used just a bit more polishing here and there at quite a few points. Meanwhile, the work on Aminette's design is really good. From the makeup from the Mummy Princess's corpse-like skin tone and abundance of tattoos, to the CGI, which brings out some of the more unnatural elements of her appearance, such as her eyes and parts of her decaying skin, for a good portion of the film. If you were to ask me what would be a good blend of CGI and prosthetics or makeup, Aminette's design would be my go-to. So overall, despite some wonky parts here and there, the visual spectacle in The Mummy 2017 does work pretty well for the most part, in providing exciting and intense action, especially in certain key set pieces. Now, considering that this is part of the Universal Monsters IP, and that IP is often classified as being part of the horror genre, it's fair to assume that the film will try to scare people as well as excite them. So let's take a look at how it tries to achieve its scares. The Mummy 2017 essentially relies on jump scares for the most part. Moments where something unsettling, like a zombie, pops up just to give the audience a little jolt of excitement, which could be forgiven if the musical score, composed by Brian Tyler, wasn't trying so hard to add to these scares. We would have a scene that goes quiet, where we soak in some atmosphere, and then a monster pops up while the music tries to tell you, be scared now. Some of these scenes would have served better without a musical sting, or at least a minimal amount of music. There's very few moments where the film tries to make the scares a bit more subtle. For instance, when Jenny is looking for Morton in the subway, a zombie is shown to be coming up behind her in the distance. The musical score lets us know about it, but it's not so overt about it, and this bit ends up being a fairly effective moment that adds suspense to whether or not Jenny is going to notice the zombie before it catches her. Another good moment is when Nick and Jenny are in a flooded cavern and trying to regain composure after a run-in with a zombie. Nick is trying to comfort Jenny, who has become really scared by their predicament. Then Aminette creeps up in the water behind Jenny like a shark ready to catch its prey. The payoff for this moment comes in when Aminette pulls Jenny down under in order to drown her. It's not a blatant, obvious jump scare, but rather it's more subtle and creepier, and it's also set up very well. If the film had more scares like these, as opposed to ones where the soundtrack blasts loudly as a monster pops up or is even in view, or if there really isn't anything all that scary in view at all, then the horror element would at least be a little less generic. However, despite the film's efforts, the horror element is sadly lacking, due to the film putting more emphasis on being an action movie with a horror tinge to it. Well, that just about covers the technical side of things in The Mummy 2017, those being its action scenes, its visual effects, and its scare tactics. For for the lack of a better title for that aspect. And it seems that there isn't much else to do now except to put a cap on this monster mash of a series. So, I think it's time for us to do just that. So, we are finally at the end of this essay video series. Now, we've gone over a whole bunch of pros and cons in The Mummy 2017, and it's pretty safe to conclude that the film is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of overall quality. It has some pretty notable objective flaws that definitely bring it down significantly, but the things that do work, that are well done, are at least enough to counteract them to where the film as a whole is able to land somewhere in the middle. It manages to be not as bad as many have made it out to be, yet not as good as it could have been. The character work is light, but there is some fairly solid substance for some of the more significant characters in the film. The action sequences are well done, and the technical aspects are pretty strong, despite some spotty bits here and there in terms of the CGI at some points. While the horror elements certainly could have been better, the film does work well as an action film with a Universal Monsters twist, where the villains are more, as one would say, unnatural than what we typically see Tom Cruise combating against or running from. The cast does fine overall, with some members standing out in the best way. The world building isn't the most well executed and has some problems, particularly with how Prodigium handles the issue on containing Aminet, despite supposedly being a dedicated force of monster hunters. However, there are aspects in the world building that is compelling and is filled to the brim with potential for a universe that may never get to be fully realized. The next issue, sadly, is how the film was clearly trying to play catch-up on a trend and wants to be more like the cool kids. But it ended up trying way too hard in order to get there in a short amount of time, such as with its awkward attempts at humor in several points throughout its runtime, and with the way it even stops the main plot to set up a bigger universe, resulting in certain aspects to be at least somewhat compromised. Its aspirations were greater than what it was capable of achieving, at least in this state. And it's a shame too, because a modern Universal Monsters shared universe could have been awesome, but alas, the execution of this film, while not the worst as a film on its own, is problematic as a launching pad for a franchise. It's like if the MCU started out with Iron Man 2, which was made to pack in some Easter eggs in order to quickly get people pumped up for future films, instead of Iron Man 1 from 2008, which was a standalone feature with tiny nuggets of world building sprinkled in on occasion. There are quite a few other films out there that tried to start a shared universe only to fail miserably, and even sort of deserved that failure in some cases. But The Mummy 2017 is perhaps the most tragic example of that to date, because a modern-day Universal Monsters franchise could have worked if the film in question had a good script doctor, and didn't lean so heavily on trying to start such a franchise without a clear roadmap. And all of that is why The Mummy 2017, despite being a film that I personally like for the things that it has going for it, is overall average by an objective standard in filmmaking. And thus ends this essay video series on The Mummy 2017. I would like to thank you all very, very much for checking this one out. This was a series of videos that I really wanted to do, mainly just to give the film in question a fair shake. I'm a big fan of monster movies, including those in the catalog of Universal's classic monster franchise, and so I was kind of pulling for the franchise to make a comeback, and to be honest, I still am. However, setting my personal enjoyment of the film aside, I can certainly understand why it didn't succeed at being the launching point for that potential comeback. That being said, I devoted quite a bit of time towards the script for this one, taking me months to iron it all out and to make sure that my perception of the film was as accurate as possible after having seen it a fair amount of times over the years since that one evening back in 2017. I was actually originally going to try to put this series out, or at least the first part of it out, in time for the Halloween season of 2021. However, other projects, such as my essay video on Frankenstein 1931, which I do recommend you all check out by the way, some reviews on my GeForce 784 page, and a big Halloween party that I was hosting that year kind of made it impossible for me to find the time to get knee deep into this thing. So I figured I'd push this series back until around the 5-year anniversary of the film's release. While I found this to be a very engaging experience, I am a bit glad to finally have this series under my belt. I can't really see myself doing a 3-part essay video series for a while though. So whatever my next project will be, it will be either a single video or a 2-parter. Unless it ends up being another Godzilla vs. Kong scenario where the project just explodes into a bigger project than I would have expected, then it might be a 3-parter by accident. But for now, I hope you all found this 3-part essay video series of mine on The Mummy 2017 to be worthwhile, and I hope it's encouraged you all to stick around on my channel to check back on my previous works, as well as wait in anticipation for what is to come. Once again, I thank you all for watching, and until my next video or series, I will see you all later.